Hello, this is Bob Doman, and I'd like to speak with you about education, about the neurodevelopmental aspects of education, and more specifically about homeschooling. For those of you who are presently doing homeschool, I'd like to try to paint a picture for you of what could be. And for those of you who are contemplating homeschool, I will try and give you a vision of how we suggest you do homeschool. I suspect our plan will make homeschooling a whole lot easier, a lot more fun, and significantly more successful than what you might have been imagining. Let's start from the beginning. What is education? In truth, if you want to understand something and accomplish something, you really need to start by defining it. And if we look at education and the functional definition of education, essentially how it's applied by schools, we look at that operational definition of education, and essentially means that we're providing all children with basically the same curriculum. A curriculum that helpfully teaches them the material that is deemed appropriate and adequate, disregarding their individual learning abilities and or issues, talents, and interests, and ignoring the fact that our children are all unique and that virtually every child can simply be made not just more knowledgeable, but much smarter. If we look at that definition, it doesn't sound terribly positive. And in truth, if we look at the outcomes of education as it is today, and what's happening in most of our schools, it is sadly not a pretty picture. So let's see if we improve on that picture. Homeschool families generally build upon a little bit better definition of education. In general, homeschooling families have typically modified and improved upon an educational environment that is conducive to developing values and morals, reinforcing family beliefs, and in most cases, also providing a better quality of education. So, when we homeschool and our homeschoolers look at the job a bit differently and a little more broadly, but both definitions really need a new perspective. They're really outdated. And we need to base our new perception on potential that is based on an understanding of the foundation of learning and its impact on the innate potential of every child. Just to give you a peek at what could be.
When Jennifer Lindsay was born 13 years ago, her parents were given some bad news. She had been stuck in the birth canal, swallowed meconium, and was deprived of oxygen.
And when they took her out, she wasn't moving. We thought she was dead. We were told that she would probably have a lot of physical and mental problems.
Child developmentalist Robert Doman Jr. first began working with Jennifer when she was 8.
That's also when she picked up the violin. In the 4th grade, Lindsay was attacking algebra. At 13, tackling college.
It is my honor to present you with the 1999 Essence Award. And a special thanks to Robert Doman Jr. and the National Academy of Child Development. Without him, I would still be brain damaged.
Today, along with her operatic overachievements,
I've sung for Colin Powell, Ted Turner, Chris Rock.
Lindsay humors us with her humble education.
I have a bachelor's degree in math from Harvey Mudd College, and I have a master's in applied math from Columbia University, and a master's in computer science from the Johns Hopkins University.
Wait, it gets better.
I am currently working as an aerospace engineer, helping to design the next generation of GPS satellites. When I give a concert or if I've given a talk to a youth group, some of the kids or their parents will come up to me afterwards and say, "What do I do? Can you give me advice?" And the first thing I do is recommend them to Bob. Go see Bob.
When I first came to see Bob, he taught me many activities doing program with my daughter, and I was able to use Bob's program with my subsequent children to teach them to read at a very early age. 4 of my children so far have graduated college about the time they should be graduating high school, 18, 19 years old. 2 of them finished their master's degrees, one at 20 and the other at 18 years old. One from USC and one from USC Irvine in computer science.
Well, having watched that video, I hope you have a new perception of what could be. You know, we have everything from a range with Jennifer, who was a child with a brain injury from birth, terrible prognosis, who with a lot of specific input and targeting all of her neurodevelopmental needs, very quickly accelerated, overcame all of her issues, and has ended up being, you know, a very, very successful, high-functioning individual. In the case of Michelle and her children, she, like Jennifer's mother, homeschooled. Michelle homeschooled all her children. And as you can see, all went to college early, and as of today are all doing fantastically well. What you might not have been able to tell from the video, Michelle, who homeschooled all her children and is still homeschooling her children, is about the calmest person you're going to meet. I mean, she is mellow, she is relaxed, and you would never guess that she has homeschooled 9 children. It's not that hard when you know what you're doing, okay? But I want you to gain a perspective. As you listen to what I'm talking about, I want you to listen with a perspective of what could be, what can be, okay? So in general, you know, I think, you know, you should want your children to be as smart as they can be. You, in truth, may not be motivated to have your children go to college early or be exceptional, but you should want your children to simply be as smart as they can and to give them the tools to succeed in life. Whether you're a brain surgeon, an engineer, a musician, a farmer, or a plumber, smarter is better. Smart people can be successful in whatever they choose to be. Okay, this is important. Okay, it's very important. You know, look at all those people you know, regardless of what they do, and try to identify those people who are smart, who are really smart. And you should see a correlation between how smart they are and how well they're doing and how well they're putting their lives together. So as we move forward, let's look at a new, if you will, 21st century definition of education. So let's give you a new definition of education. My definition of education, if you will. Education is the process by which we further the development of the foundation of learning and cognition, while providing the means to effectively and efficiently administer a holistic, child-centered, academic, and social opportunity that facilitates learning, develops skills, habits, and values that permit one to think, pursue their passions, succeed in their chosen field, live a quality life, and contribute to their family and society. Okay, that's a little involved, but essentially what I'm saying is we want to start off by making our kids smarter and then provide them with a child student-centered educational experience. And if we do that as homeschoolers within the home, that provides us a lot of additional opportunities to put together all of the pieces that we need to do to provide our kids with a real opportunity. Now, NACD has spent the last 40 years designing individualized homeschool and developmental programs, innovating and helping the full spectrum of children from all over the world reach their innate potentials. You know, as you can see, we are pretty much all over the world. And if you will, being an international organization affords us some very unique opportunities because we're positioned to see what is happening virtually everywhere in the world relative to child development and education. And with that, we are able to constantly develop, expand, and modify what we are doing in our approaches, which is extremely valuable. You know, if you will, our needs as an organization to continue to grow and continue to develop are very significant. We are not static. We don't have a thing that's been the thing for decades. Right? It's constantly changing, it's constantly developing, it's constantly being modified based on what we learn and what we experience and the insights we gain and the results of the new methodologies we're applying. So it's dynamic. It's very dynamic. The key to our work, if you will, is something called neuroplasticity. And, understanding and utilizing the foundation of human development, function, and education is neuroplasticity. And in truth, if you don't understand neuroplasticity, it's going to be very difficult for you to be as efficient and effective as you possibly could be in your child's development and education. So let's help you understand what that means. Simply said, neuroplasticity is the mechanism that grows, changes, and develops the brain. Brains don't change because they get older. Brains change because input, be it positive or negative, changes the brain by growing connections and networks between brain cells. If you look at this diagram, you see what it looks like as brain cells and networks grow. That physical growth of those connections between brain cells and neurons essentially means that learning has occurred, that we have in fact stimulated the brain. Education literally means we're changing the brain. Okay? If we think we're teaching something and in fact haven't stimulated and haven't changed the brain, we fail. We haven't taught anything. It's actually changing the brain that produces development, produces learning. Okay, that's very important to understand. Education is changing brains. Now, to trigger neuroplasticity, to use this foundation to learn, we need to apply simply the specific appropriate input with sufficient frequency, intensity, and duration. Now, input is interesting in today's world of education because for most students, the majority of their time in education is spent with output. Meaning when you're telling your child something, you're showing your child something, you're providing them with input and learning is occurring. If they're doing another 100 math problems, all right, or answering a bunch of questions, that's output. Learning occurs from input. Okay, that's really important to understand. It's input that triggers neuroplasticity and helps change the brain. Okay, so we have to determine what is specific appropriate input, and we'll talk more about that in a second, and provide it with sufficient frequency, often enough, sufficient intensity. Intensity is a big word, means strong enough input and over long enough duration to, in fact, stimulate that brain growth and development and change. Specific, again, is very important. And specific implies that we are teaching to the child's sweet spot, if you will. Now, let me explain that. If a child is at a specific point, for example, in their understanding of mathematics, that child's sweet spot is a step above where they are. Not a big step above, not a step below, just a small step above right where they are. So you have the foundation and you're building on the foundation. You're not above them so that you're losing them and discouraging them. And you're not below them where you're boring them. Okay? So specific input is child specific. If you have 30 kids in a classroom, you've got 30 children with 30 different sweet spots. The more children you have that you're trying to teach, the less effective and efficient you can be. This also is one of the problems with curriculum, which we'll talk about more. Okay? There isn't a curriculum designed for your child. So if we're being specific, we're teaching to the child's present knowledge base and preferably their interests, and also teaching with appreciation of the child's ability to actually process the material. Now, we talk about what we do at NACD as targeted developmental and educational intervention. All right, and that word targeted means we understand where the child is neurodevelopmentally, what they can process, what they can comprehend, complexity of their thought, their knowledge base, and all that together helps determine where the target is. And the closer we are to hitting that target for that child, the better job we can do. So let's break down these pieces. Okay? Frequency. Frequency simply means how often the input comes in. All right, so if you're trying to teach a specific thing, let's talk about math facts. Math facts are one of those things that are often problematic for kids. And to teach math facts, we often need to do it with sufficient frequency, meaning we're telling that child that fact over and over and over again to help get it into his brain. All right, most things that you're teaching your child, you can't really just say once or show them once. To actually get the information into long-term memory, to actually change the brain, grow those connections, we generally have to put information in with sufficient frequency. Then we need to do it with sufficient intensity. Now, one good way to understand intensity is to imagine that you're standing in front of a variety of classrooms and looking out over the students. Now, you're going to have classrooms where half the kids are asleep. You have classrooms where the kids are looking out the window, they're looking here and there, teacher's talking, nobody's listening. Occasionally you're going to get that teacher who's got some intensity, who is connecting with the students, who is trying to excite them in what they're doing. Okay, that's intensity. Ultimately, the intensity is controlled by the student. What you do can affect it, but ultimately it's how engaged the student is with the content, with the material, that determines the intensity of the input. If they can relate what's going on to other things, again, we're targeted, all right, that increases the intensity. If it's interesting, that increases the intensity. But something they're really into, that increases the intensity. Okay? That child who remembers most nothing of the recent history chapter you did could very possibly tell you about Star Wars in detail. Star Wars probably had a lot more intensity for them than the history unit did. Okay, intensity is huge. To give you a further example of intensity, I like to tell the story that we measure intensity on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the highest, 1 being you're going to sleep. And if you would, imagine you're driving down the freeway, and you're driving down a freeway you've traveled every day commuting to work or whatever. A freeway that has billboards along the side and various things. And although you may be going past those things once or twice a day and you've done it for years, you still don't really know what's on that billboard. And you still know a lot of those things you're passing. But imagine, if you would, that as you're driving down that freeway, an accident occurs in front of you. A head flies through the air and lands splat on your windshield. Okay? That's what I call a 10. All right? That's intensity. And even though that event occurred within a few seconds, it would have occurred with sufficient intensity that it would have affected and changed your brain instantly. Thus, you'll remember it forever. That's intensity. Yeah. All right, then the next piece is duration. Now, duration means how long you're providing the input. One of the greatest problems that I see in education is there is too much duration in general. The school day is too long. There's too much homework. All right. More isn't necessarily better, because as you increase duration, you tend to decrease intensity. So often the longer you go, the more you're trying to accomplish in a day, the more you're trying to stuff in there, actually the less actually gets into the brain, because you have decreased the intensity. All right, so the foundation of changing the brain of learning is neuroplasticity. And we take advantage of neuroplasticity by understanding how to be specific with our input, targeted with our input, and supply it with the appropriate frequency, intensity, and duration. Now let's talk about another really important piece. Processing power. A huge part of the educational foundation is building processing power. So to help you begin to understanding processing, let's start by testing your processing, or what we call short-term auditory memory. When we look at individuals, we look at auditory processing and visual processing. How much you take in from what you hear, how much you take in from what you see. But for the moment, let's focus on the auditory component and let's test your auditory processing. Now, auditory processing has been tested forever with a simple thing called a digit span. How many numbers you can hear in sequence and recall, how many numbers you can look at in sequence and recall. So again, right now, let's test your auditory sequential processing. So I hope you have paper and pencil. If you don't, pause this and go get one. Okay, to test your auditory processing short-term memory, I'm going to say a sequence of numbers to you. I want you to listen to the entire sequence and then write it down. Please make sure you don't start writing until you've heard the entire sequence. Okay, we ready? 3, 5, 9, 1, 4. Okay, did you get it? The number was 3, 5, 9, 1, 4. That was a 5. Let's take you up and try a tougher one. 4, 6, 9, 0, 3, 2. Okay, that one was 4, 6, 9, 0, 3, 2. Okay, did you get that? All right, let's make it a little tougher. 7, 1, 3, 6, 2, 9, 4. Okay, that one was 7, 1, 3, 6, 2, 9, 4. Okay, if you got that, you got a 7. Let's try a couple more. All right, this is going to get a little tough. 1, 8, 7, 0, 2, 4, 1, 3. Okay, that one was 1, 8, 7, 0, 2, 4, 1, 3. Okay, if you got that one, you're doing great. All right, one last one. Ready? 9, 2, 4, 1, 7, 2, 8, 0, 6. Okay, that last one was 9, 2, 4, 1, 7, 2, 8, 0, 6. Okay, now we just tested your auditory digit span within a range. The range I tested you in was 5 digits to 9 digits. The vast majority of the population from the age of about 6 to into our 20s falls within this range of 5 to 9. As you'll hear later, there are some who go way, way beyond that. And unfortunately, after our mid-20s, our processing abilities without intervention tends to slip, decrease. Okay? So this is auditory sequential processing. We could do a similar test to test the visual sequential processing. Okay, if you're going to test your children at home, do what I did auditorily, which is slowly at about 1 second intervals with an even tone, read them the sequence of numbers. Just say it one time and have them either write it down or repeat it for you. To test their visual sequential processing, write down sequences of numbers on a card, starting low with a few numbers and going high. Show the child the number sequence, have them read it out loud, give them about a 3-second exposure, take it away, and again have them attempt to repeat the sequence or write the sequence down. That will give you information relative to their auditory and visual sequential processing or short-term memory. Okay, this diagram should help you understand some of these foundational pieces. Essentially what we have a diagram that represents 3 individuals. One with short-term memory of 5, one with short-term memory of 7, the other with a processing short-term memory of 9. Each of these individuals is receiving the same educational input, the same amount of input. But based on their processing, that determines how much of what you tried to put in actually got processed, what actually got to their brain, got through their short-term memory. And then if you look at the beakers below, those represent what is called working memory. And we're going to test your working memory here in a bit. But essentially, working memory is reflected by a reverse digit span. How many numbers can you listen to or look at in a sequence and say backwards? The larger your reverse processing, the larger your working memory, the more pieces your brain can manipulate, which means the complexity of thought. Working memory is now being called the new IQ, appropriately so, because your working memory is a better determining factor of how successful you're going to be than is your actual IQ. Okay, working memory is hugely important. So it's the foundation of complexity of thought, and it's also the foundation of what's called executive function, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And going back to our diagram, you can see the beakers at the bottom, they get larger because as we improve our processing, we're processing more and more information. And one of the really incredible things about the brain is the more you put into it, the more it can hold. Okay, so if we look at these pieces and the differences between this range of 5 to 9, which is the typical range, you can be providing, 3 different kids with the same information and have 3 dramatically different results based on where their processing skills are. So this is really, really important to understand. And before we go any further, let me tell you that this can all be changed. It can all be improved, and rather easily, okay? Rather easily. Now let me go back and talk about Jennifer, Lindsay, and Michelle and their children. Jennifer started off, as I say, with a child with a brain injury. When she came to me, she was functioning at low level. She had severe processing issues, along with everything else would have probably been called LD and ADD, ADHD. And we worked at homeschooling again with her and focused on building her processing skills as we were providing an educational opportunity. Jennifer's processing ended up with digit spans in the low 20s. That is, she could listen to a sequence of over 20 numbers, repeat it, or repeat it backwards. Okay? That is what permitted her to function so well and at such a high level. Michelle's kids, at the time they were ready to go to college in their teens, typically had digit spans in the range of 14 to 17. And Michelle could tell you the difference between her kids who processed 14 to 17. They were all brilliant. They all did exceptionally well. And all of them at the foundation of what they were doing educationally was building the foundation of learning, right? Putting their neurological act together and developing superior abilities to process information. So we've been working on processing for more than 40 years. We started off working on just one-on-one activities. And back in the very early 80s, we developed the first computer program to work on brain development. For those of you who are old enough, we actually ran that program on a Commodore PET computer, which had a cassette drive. So that's how long we've been doing that. And then we created a program called Brain Builder. And today we have a program called Simply Smarter, which is an online program that works on processing skills for kids from about 6 up through adults. We also have many, many one-on-one activities that we have that are designed to build auditory and visual processing and also visualization and conceptualization, which is the ability to think in pictures and the ability to think in words. So when we approach things neurodevelopmentally, we need to look at the individual and look at a variety of significant pieces that need to be addressed and developed. And again, this is the foundation. It is, I can't overstate how important this is. And just like everything else neurodevelopmentally, It's through neuroplasticity that processing power develops, through the application of specific input that's delivered again with sufficient frequency, intensity, and duration. Let's talk for a minute about preschool and your little ones. One of, I think, the greatest tragedies today is that more and more children are going to preschools, are going to daycare centers, and if you will, just simply being away from their moms. I know this isn't socially, politically correct, to say that it's good for kids to be home with mothers. But I can say with all confidence that neurodevelopmentally, if we have a functional mother, it's tough to beat the input that a mom can provide. I had an experience back in the early 80s that was a rude awakening. I did a morning radio show out in LA, a TV show, pardon me, and it was filmed at the UCLA Child Development Center. And the Child Development Center was a huge room, like a gymnasium. And in the gymnasium were a bunch of little preschool kids and then a bunch of teachers. The interviewer was discussing with the head of the program there and myself what was appropriate for preschool kids. And the director of the program there shocked me by saying that children being home with their mothers is abnormal. This is back in the 80s, early 80s. And what she went on to say was that what children need is to be in organized settings, structured settings with professionals. I was horrified back in the 80s when I heard that, and I still am today. Unfortunately, that attitude has kind of permeated society, where it has come to be perceived that virtually all children are better off in daycare and preschool environments. Now, in truth, children who are in deprived environments where they receive minimal input and stimulation, they are better off in preschool and daycare centers if they're good. But for the majority of the children in the country, what can be offered at home, one-on-one, is virtually impossible to beat. If you're thinking about, your kids when they're 2 or 3 or 4, preschool age, what you automatically do when you're interacting with those kids is constantly modify and change what you're doing to fit them. If you're reading to them, if you're talking to them, if you're playing with them, they give you constant feedback relative to how targeted you're being with them. If you're talking above their heads, they get distracted, they're not paying attention. If you're talking below them, they're getting bored, you're losing them again. And what you tend to do as a parent is constantly modify your input to target where your child is. Now, change that up a little bit and go from you and one child to you and 2 kids. And I'm sure you can see how less effective it becomes as soon as there's 2. Imagine 5. Now, if you will, imagine 30, all right? There's no way you can modify what you're doing to target 30 individuals. So the further we get from one-to-one input, the more difficult it is to be targeted, the more difficult it is to react to the feedback of the child and modifying what we're doing to fit the child. I firmly believe that this trend through the last decades to increase the number of kids in preschool and daycare has largely led to the explosion of attention issues, ADD and ADHD. Now, the vast majority of kids we see that come with those labels actually have auditory processing problems. And because they have auditory processing problems, they're distractible, they're not paying attention, tend to be a bit hyper, if you will, globally immature, and functioning as would younger children. Now, one of the really positive things is if you can work one-on-one with your preschool kids, a little goes a long way at changing them virtually for the rest of their lives. If we start little children off and build their processing skills in the preschool ages, these kids are off to a running start and are processing more and more and more information than all the other kids. To tell you a little story, one of our families has a Down syndrome child, and she has a younger brother. And the family has applied many of the things we designed for their daughter with their younger son. His name is Owen. And particularly, they've worked on his processing skills. And make a long story short, last time I saw the family, Owen was there, 3 years old. Owen has a digit span of about 6, okay, where many adults are. Owen spoke to me conversationally in full sentences, and Owen asked if I could give him the reading test that I gave his sister. And I did that, and 3-year-old Owen's word recognition score on a standardized test was in the 5th grade range. His mother spends minutes per day with him doing specific targeted input, and he's that accelerated. So these little kids that we start off strong end up doing fantastically well. And if you will, processing is the link to behavior, maturity, and language. There's a direct link between processing and these functions. For example, typically kids who are 1.5 process one piece of information. And as a result, they generally are speaking in single words. When they can sequence 2 pieces, like following a 2-step direction, we see their language increase to 2 and 3 word phrases. We see their attention span increase and their maturity increase. We also often see them enter what are called terrible twos, which is essentially saying their complexity of thought is processing 2 pieces, I want or don't want. When the sequential processing moves up to a 3, we see kids expand their language. They're processing more. They're speaking in 3, 4, 5 word sentences, understand a lot. We see their maturity increase, all as a direct reflection of the processing. At NACD, we work with a full range of kids. So we work with the typical kids, accelerated kids, and certainly kids with a broad range of developmental problems. And it's very, very interesting to look at that correlation between where processing is and where function is. We've learned not to pay a whole lot of attention to the age of a child. We pay the attention to the processing of the child. The processing that is the key to understanding what the child can take in, what the child can understand, and how to educate that child. All right, let's define some of these critical pieces, a bit more. Again, if you look back on your funnel graph, short-term memory, working memory, which is associated with executive function, long-term memory. Short-term memory is simply how much you can take in visually or auditorily in a sequence. If you will, that's the difference between being able to process somebody saying a single word, to a phrase, to a sentence, to a paragraph. The better your short-term memory, the more of that information you can take in. If something's coming in above your processing power, you simply don't get it. So short-term memory, again, is how much you can take in of what is said and what you see. Now let's talk about working memory. Now, to help you understand working memory, let's test your working memory. Now, we test working memory with a reverse digit span. So what I'm going to do is, again, read you a number sequence, and I want you to listen to the sequence, and after I've said the entire sequence, I want you to write it down backwards. Okay, reverse. Okay, we ready? First one, 5, 8, 1. Okay, so reverse, that is 1, 8, 5. Okay, next. 1, 4, 7, 3. And reverse, that would be 3, 7, 4, 1. Okay, next. 9, 7, 2, 5, 1. Okay, what you should have written down is 1, 5, 2, 7, 9. This is getting a little bit tough. Hang in there. Okay, focus. Bring up your intensity. Okay, here's the next one. 8, 0, 1, 7, 2, 4. Okay, you should have written down 4, 2, 7, 1, 0, 8. Next one. 2, 1, 5, 9, 3, 6, 7. Okay, that was 7, 6, 3, 9, 5, 1, 2. Okay, last one. Focus here. Last chance. You ready? 7, 9, 5, 0, 8, 1, 3, 2. Okay, you should have written down 2, 3, 1, 8, 0, 5, 9, 7. Now, as I mentioned before, the typical range for kids from 6 or 7 up to young adults is generally 5 to 9. For reverse digit spans, it's kind of 3 to 7, 8. Now, as adults taking that, if you're a little discouraged, don't be. The nice thing about neuroplasticity is that as long as we're breathing, neuroplasticity exists and we can change function. As an example, got a recent testimony from one of my families. It's a family in Bucharest. They have a little brain injured guy. And the parents last spring, understanding what we do on our concepts, decided to work on their sequential processing skills. And they were pretty typical 6, 7s. And last I heard, the dad's digit spans are now like 16 and 17. That's exceptional, but not as exceptional as mom's because her digit spans are now like 20 and 21 forward and reverse. These folks are very aware of the change in their function. Their ability to learn, their ability to understand, their ability to communicate, their ability to think has improved dramatically. So don't worry about age. If you say, I've got a teenager and it's too late, no, it certainly is not too late, and it's not too late for you either. So what we want to do as our foundation educationally is to make our kids smarter. I can't tell you how easy it is to make your kids smarter by just developing these basic processing skills. You should know, if you have more than one child, that the smarter the kids are, the easier they are to teach. And if they're easy to teach, generally they learn to love learning. And once we have developed the processing skills, taught them to love learning, they virtually teach themselves. So if we look at homeschooling through our approach, the NACD way, with targeted developmental and educational intervention programs, we start off by developing superior processing, short-term memory, working memory, visualization, conceptualization. That is, we're building the foundation of the ability to learn and think. We then accelerate reading and math with very individualized programs and individual instruction. I talked before about specific input, targeted input, teaching the child at their sweet spot. If we do that, we can accelerate reading and math in a very, very short time per day. And after accelerating the reading and math and giving the educational foundation, if you will, we then work to literally turn the kids on to learning. All right, exploring things that are interesting to them and building on those interests that they have. Making learning fun, making learning exciting, turn them on to it. We also work to turn the children into readers. What's a reader? Reader is a person not only who can read, but a person who actually learns to read, to be a reader, to read for information, read for knowledge, read for entertainment, read to understand what's going on in the world, to turn them into functional readers, learners. Overall, we want to provide the kids with a targeted, individualized educational experience. All right, so we want, with everything we're teaching, to make it child-centered, taking their interests, expanding on their interests, targeting where they are, tailoring what we're due to fit them. What we're not doing is using and basing education on a curriculum. We're going to talk more about that, but curriculum can be the killer. And then what we want to do is build self-respect, confidence, teach the kids responsibility, teach the kids values. We can do that at home. One of the real advantages of homeschool is that we can work with the whole child. At NACD, we work with whole kids. What that means is we look at kids' health, their diet, their nutrition, their sleep, their behavior, their self-esteem, their sense of responsibility, their social function and skills, all aspects of their mental and developmental function. If you will, the world is kind of compartmentalized. Everyone, you have, 10 different doctors that work with 10 different parts of your body. And you've got teachers who work with different subjects. And you got all these people working with pieces of kids. The foundation, if you will, for you as a parent, and the benefit you have as a parent is your whole child. And that gives you a great advantage over virtually everybody else who's trying to intervene with your child. Because you can see the correlation between the different pieces, between their health and diet and their nutrition and how they're sleeping and what their energy level is and how much exercise they're getting and how awake they are during the day and what they love and what they hate. Okay? The whole child. Now, going back to, the wonderful thing about curriculum, it's been said often that on graduation day, most high school students have already forgotten 99% of what they learned. I haven't actually seen any data to back that statement up, but I suspect the data would come pretty close to that. It's shocking today to sit with high school seniors and college freshmen and talk to them about what they know and discover incredibly how much they don't know. Matter of fact, you can run into trouble talking to them, finding about anything they know beyond music and movies and what's going on socially, right? Think of the thousands and thousands and thousands of hours dedicated to try to shove in curriculum that never went anywhere, never changed the brain. It's not there. It's as though it never happened. So understand, curriculum is not the answer to better education. It, in fact, is the pit that educators fall into. I'll give you a perspective. And I remember having a family come to me who had 3 kids. And they had one child who was an A student, they had a child who was a C student, and they had a child who failed. And they started off living in New York, going to schools in New York. And they moved down to the Atlanta area, and different school, different curriculum, and guess what? They still had an A student, a C student, and an F student. And they moved to Southern California, different school, different curriculum. Shocker, they still had an A student, a C student, and an F student. It's not about curriculum. We can change and change and change curriculums, but if we do not change the developmental foundation from which the children are working, they're not going to significantly change. Now, education is not about throwing a lot of stuff at your children and hoping that some of it sticks. It's not about curriculums. It's about the foundation of learning and accessing your innate intelligence and being smarter, and parents teaching smarter. And it's important to understand you don't need to spend more time with homeschool. You actually need to spend less time and smarter time. You can take a little lesson from Finland. Most people have no clue, but Finland is internationally one of the top countries in education in the world, as opposed to the United States, which I think the last time they looked was about 41st in math, 25th in reading, and 26th in science in the world, despite all the money we're throwing at education, despite the kids going to school for 6 hours a day, having hours of homework on top of it. One of the keys in Finland is kids start school at an older age. The school year is shorter. The school days are shorter. They have no homework and dramatically better outcomes. Frequency, intensity, and duration. Remember that? Okay. As you increase duration, you decrease intensity. Trying to shove in more typically gets in less. We want to be specific and we want to be targeted. Okay, our job as parents is to help our kids become educated, successful, happy, contributing, and smart adults. And if you will, that goes way beyond algebra. Okay, there's a lot of things we need to teach them, and we need to understand how to do it better. At NACD, we've been redefining education since we started in 1979. We've done that by being constantly motivated to understand more and develop more tools and better understanding to do it. At NACD, we design individual developmental and educational homeschool programs. We've developed lots of materials. The Simply Smarter system I mentioned is one of them. We have apps, relative to cognition and processing. We have cognition coach apps for preschool kids. And literally thousands of tools in our toolbox that we incorporate into individual programs. As I stated, we've got people that come to us from all over the world. People come to us generally for homeschooling for a variety of reasons. One is simply to accelerate and maximize their children's function. So a lot of families with typical kids, they come to us simply to do better and help their kids function higher. We also have families, homeschooling families, that come to us because they don't know how to address issues ranging from behaviors and compliance to learning problems, attention problems, outright learning disabilities, dyslexia, ADD, ADHD, as well as children with a broad range of issues ranging from brain injury and autism, Down syndrome, and other genetic issues. For children with developmental problems, it really is impossible to beat homeschool. We face realities with the children and the families we work with, realities such as both parents have to work and they can homeschool. It makes our job and their job significantly more difficult. We're often trying to do strategies like we start the kids off late in their school day and work with them in the morning, try to get them to come early, work them after school, try to get to school not to give them homework. So we have time to really work on the important pieces. As homeschoolers, you can do more than virtually any school can do. As homeschoolers, you can work smart and you can make your kids smarter. You can accomplish a lot more in a lot less time per day. We can do a full-blown homeschool program working on all the developmental issues for most typical kids in 2 or 3 hours a day. So parents, let me leave you with one thing. One thing I want you to take away from this. You have the power to do what no school can or will. Please don't replicate what schools are doing. Take advantage of your opportunity to homeschool and do it right.